Hello, this is Matt, and welcome to the Advanced Age Role-Playing Gamers podcast, next installment of Playing With Myself. Today we're going to take a look at Twilight 2000 4th edition and all things explosions. So what are some of the topics that we're going to be covering in this briefing? Well, first and most important, blast. What is it and why is it going to kill you? How do I know if my weapon has a blast effect? So we're going to take a look at different kinds of weapons so that you can see on the weapon cards what's got a blast effect and what doesn't. 3, what is an omnidirectional blast weapon versus a directional blast weapon? And why does your GM love to use them to potentially kill the entire party? 4, mines. And of course, why is it so ironic that you just got this new pair of tennis shoes? 5, so you want to make your own explosives? We're going to take a look at 8-Fingered Bob's how-to guide. And finally, 6, other explosives that you might just stumble on or have tossed at you while you're trying to survive in this post-apocalyptic world. So what is blast? So for Twilight 2000, blast is pretty much anything that explodes. But why don't we go a little more scholarly here and take a look at what the Oxford Dictionary says. First, a destructive wave of highly compressed air spreading outward from an explosion. Or 2, an enjoyable experience or lively party. Well, depending on which side you are, either receiving or delivering, both of those are some pretty good definitions. Okay, so we're going to take a look at a couple of weapon cards. And we're going to examine, so how can you tell whether a particular weapon has a blast damage or blast rating? So if you look on the left, we've got an AK-74, and down there in the first column of the second line, it actually has a thing called blast, and there's a small dash on it, right? So this is your typical slug thrower, doesn't have any blast damage potential, so nope, no blast here. But if we go over to the right, and we take a look at this fragmentation grenade, you can see right there the third sort of stat they've got is blast. And what you'll note is that there's a letter code in there. So we're going to cover that on the next slide. But that's really what you're going to care about as far as how big of an explosion and how dangerous it is to your group. You can also see that it does have a damage and critical rating just like regular weapons. Another thing of note, you'll see that there is a armor stat. This armor stat has a +1 on it. And again, we'll cover that a little bit further down, but that means that armor is going to have better resistance to this kind of damage. Okay, so we're going to look at the omnidirectional blast. So a blast kind of going out in all of directions. This is sort of the template that you'll be using. Blast has a rating from A to D, A being the highest power, D being the least power. And so what you can see in this omnidirectional blast chart is that if you take the point of initial explosion, right? So if this is, we're going to look at the largest, most powerful explosion, an A-rated blast. You have the center point. That particular hex is going to have the blast rating of A, and then around it, for each additional hex that you move out, it's going to reduce the strength of that blast. So anyone in that second ring, they'd be affected by a B class blast or B strength blast. Again, going out to C and D, and then beyond that, you're too far out of the blast radius for it to be any particular damage or threat to you. You can see on the bottom left here, we've kind of got what that means. So every explosive has a certain amount of damage and a crit threshold. And the way it determines its success to whether it damages you is by the intensity of the blast. So a blast A, which is the highest again, rolls 2d12s to try to succeed in damaging you, right, or injuring you. So if you're in that initial square, or that hex, you're going to have to roll, they're going to roll 2d12s, and a 6 or higher is going to indicate a success. The first success will do the damage listed on the weapon itself, and an additional success will count as an additional damage. And that goes out through the ring. So this is your overall template. This is looking at the largest, sort of most powerful explosions that you're going to encounter in the game. So what I'm going to do is kind of walk through that. So this is the omnidirectional pattern. So let's go ahead and take a look at what the directional pattern looks like. So a directional blast, as the name would imply, means that you have a mechanism like a plate or just the way the explosive is shaped, that it is going to project its force in a particular direction, right? Or not quite 360 degrees, but some subset of that. And if you look on the left, this is the template for a directional blast in Twilight 2000 4th edition. What you'll notice, which I thought is interesting, is there doesn't appear to be an A rated blast for directional. So that is kind of an interesting point. But what you can tell, so it is less dangerous that the blast doesn't go all over the place and it's everywhere, but the blast rating does not degrade. It degrades every 3 hexes, right, in that general direction, and it begins to spread out. So if you are anywhere in that first 3 hexes or 30 meters of the blast, you're going to get hit with the full intensity of that blast, and then it's going to begin to lower as you go farther and farther out, right? So the good is it's not everywhere. If you're off to the the left or the right hex, or you're on the other side of it, you don't get any damage. But the bad is if you are in the path, if someone puts it in part of an ambush, or you just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, there's a lot more chance that you're going to be hit with a higher blast rating in its path. Next, we're going to examine a series of scenarios using blast damage. Okay, so for our first scenario, we're going to be using a fragmentation grenade that we showed you earlier. We've got our omnidirectional blast sort of template over on the left. And if we look now at the fragmentation grenade, we go back, we see that it has a blast of C. So down below that, we have its template with C as the point of explosion at its full blast power, and the ring of hexes around it with a blast power of D. Anything beyond that's not in danger, right? So this is the template that you would use for a blast C explosion. Okay, so in our first scenario, we have our 3 survivors, Larry, Curly, and Mo. And somebody has just tossed a grenade as they are walking. They're kind of spread out. They're worried about mines, or they don't want to bunch up, so they are a little spread out. They're each in a different hex. And someone lobs a grenade, and it's going to go off right there in the hex that Curly's standing in. Okay, so you can see the template, you see their placement, and then over on the right, this is what everyone's going to have to do, right? So Larry is outside of the blast area, so no damage. Mo, who is in the outer ring, there's going to be a D6 and a D6 rolled to check to see whether he is hit and damaged by this blast. And Curly, who unfortunately is right there where it goes off, the GM's going to roll a D8 and a D8 to see if they can hit for damage. So there is a much higher chance that Curly's going to be injured by this weapon. So if you haven't already played or figured out yet, Twilight 2000 4th edition is pretty unforgiving as far as combat goes, and it's pretty easy to get seriously injured or killed. So we want to take a look at a couple ways to protect yourself against blast damage best you can, right? So one is you can reduce the damage, and the 2 ways to do that is to either be wearing armor, and of course be lucky enough to be hit in the location with that armor, or to have cover. The other is to find a way to reduce the strength of the blast itself. And the 2 ways we're going to look at it in this scenario is going prone, or ultimately taking one for the team. So in the context of Twilight 2000's game mechanics, the way you can do these is to drop prone, right? And that is a free action, or to seek cover, which is a fast action. In the rules for grenades on page 70 of the player's guide, It states that a mobility roll is used to go prone before the explosion goes off. That's if it's thrown in your hex. I kind of looked and read through back and forth in the rules, and so my suggested take on it is to just make things pretty much simple. One standard method or mechanic across all of this is to allow anyone with knowledge of that something's about to explode. Someone yells grenade, they see it, they can hear a mortar round coming in, to just basically make it across the board a mobility check to either drop prone or seek cover if it's available. This just makes it easier. What do you do in this? The player's like, what do we do in this situation? Well, if they've got one simple mechanic to try to take cover or get out of the way, it's probably a lot easier. So that's what I would do and if I was running. Okay, so now we're going to go back to this armor stat that we saw on the fragmentation grenade. So how does this reduce damage? So if you have an armor stat that we see here of +1, that means any armor that you are currently wearing is going to have one more effectiveness against damage. So if you're wearing a flak vest and you are hit, which normally has, I think, a 1 armor. So if you take damage from a blast, you take 2 points of damage, your armor would normally protect it from 1 and you'd still take a point of damage. But because this is blast damage and this particular weapon, this fragmentation grenade, offers a +1 in armor, your armor effectiveness would be 2 and therefore you would take no damage. However, remember that anytime you're inside of an explosion, you're going to be knocked prone and have to roll your coolness under fire, but at least you're not bleeding out. The other way that you can reduce damage is by having cover. So we're going to look at scenario 2 here, where Larry goes prone, Curly is oblivious, and Mo is able to take cover. Okay, so in this scenario, we're going to cover 2 things, reducing damage and reducing blast intensity. So first, we're just going to go with Curly. So again, Curly is in there. He's not paying attention. Grenade goes off right at his feet. They're going to have, the GM's going to roll a D8 and a D8 to check to see if he's been hit and damaged. He's also going to be knocked prone and have to make a coolness under fire roll. Larry up there, he has dropped prone. So he's made a mobility check. He either saw the grenade coming, somebody yelled out, hey, grenade, and he drops down. So interesting for Larry's gone prone, which reduces the blast rating. By reducing the blast rating for him, he actually takes it down below D to nothing. And so he is not in danger of being injured by this particular attack. And he's already prone, and the GM could decide whether they wanted to make him roll a coolness under fire attack or not. I'd leave that to the GM. Now, Mo has dove behind a low stone wall, and he's got full cover. So the way it works is he is in the D ring for the blast intensity. You still roll the regular D6 and D6 to see whether it's hit and damaged him or not. The difference is cover works just like armor. So if this particular wall had 4 points of cover, then the first 4 points of damage that the blast inflicted would be absorbed by the wall. And because he's fully down behind it and he's got full cover, all of his hit locations are protected. Perhaps maybe if he was standing by a low wall and he failed his mobility roll, a GM might say, okay, well, you've got partial, and if you're hit maybe in your legs, we're going to apply the additional cover as armor or to reduce damage. But if you're hit in the head or the chest or the arms, you're going to have to take full damage. But that would be scenario dependent. So again, in this case, it's full cover, and he gets that full cover rating to reduce the damage. And scenario 3, we've probably seen it in several movies, is to take one for the team, which literally means you can dive on top of the grenade. So, in this case, same thing. Larry, Curly, and Mo are walking along. Curly sees the grenade come in, and he realizes that it's kind of a surprise, and he leaps and makes this mobility check, and he jumps on top of this grenade to save his buddies. So Larry and Mo, they take no damage, right? Because if it succeeds, it reduces all of the blast potential. Curly, however, is automatically incapacitated. and automatically takes critical damage to their torso on rolling 2d10s and taking the higher effect. So it is a very brave and selfless act, but it is most likely going to leave your character either dead or very, very, very injured. So that's Curly's fate for taking one for the team. Although not covered in the rules, one home sort of brew rule you might want to consider when you're GMing is how big of an explosion can someone jump on. So for this, I haven't looked at all of the grenades. Particularly this grenade is blast radius C. So basically jumping on it reduced the blast rating for the next outer ring by 1, which took it down to nothing. I suppose if you had a much larger sort of explosive device that someone jumped on, you might rule that even though they jumped on it, the explosive device is so large that it would continue to do damage. One alternate way would be to, again, just reduce all of the other rings outside by 1. So in the case of a blast rating of D, it wouldn't go anywhere. A blast rating of C, it wouldn't go anywhere. But maybe if it was a blast rating of B, you still might have the next ring take C and then the next D. Again, you can work that out, but just a consideration you want to think about of our very large explosions when someone jumps on, they just can't block at all. So the next sort of blast that you might encounter, we're going to take a look at mines. So I call mines the double jeopardy weapon, right? So if you're not familiar with double jeopardy, it probably has a few different connotations. I'm thinking one from a military standpoint where if you commit a crime, let's say you're a soldier and you go out and you commit a crime out on the economy, you can be arrested and tried and go through all of that by the local police, get done, come back on base, and be tried and held accountable under Uniform Code of Military Justice, right? So you can literally be tried for the same crime twice. So with mines, the double jeopardy comes into the fact that mines will often have or could have a direct damage and a blast rating. And if you are step on them, you can be affected by both. For an example of this, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the chart and the very top entry. We see the M16 US anti-personnel mine. So first, it has a damage of 5 and a crit of 3. So this is already a really nasty weapon. But next to it, you see that it has a blast of C. So this is going to do direct damage to whoever steps on it. It is also going to do blast damage to whoever steps on it and anybody nearby. Good news is it does have a +1 for armor. So if you're wearing armor and you get hit in that location, well, that's going to help you out. So in our next scenario, Curly steps on a mine. We see that Curly's just not having a good time in these scenarios. So in this case, Curly has the unfortunate circumstance to step on and activate one of these M16 anti-personnel mines. Larry is a couple hexes away. Mo is right next to him in the next hex over. So Larry, again, he's outside of the blast radius, right? So we have a blast of C. So he is not going to have to take any damage or not be affected by the mine. Mo, just like if this was the fragmentation grenade, he is in that D ring, so a D strength blast. So the GM is going to roll that D6 plus D6 to see if he's been hit or damaged from the blast. Mo, of course, has the opportunity in this case that if it was available, he could either seek cover or he could also try to drop prone if he knew it's going to happen. Fortunately, for most mines, there's not a lot of warning, so probably not a good chance that you're going to get the actual ability to dodge this damage, escape this damage. All right, but for Curly is going to take 5 damage directly to his legs. Plus, the GM is also going to roll a D8 and D8 to check to see if he is hit and damaged by the blast. This is also probably not going to turn out really well. So mines, double jeopardy. That's the big takeaway, the foot stomp, is that you take damage from both the direct damage or from the blast. If we go back to the chart, we can take a look at the next entry, the M18 Claymore. That is a directional mine. That mine does not have direct damage or a crit rating. It's listed on this chart, only the blast damage itself. So again, not every mine is going to have this double jeopardy of damage, but many of them are. And as I'm looking at this, it does appear that the directional ones are the ones that do not have this direct damage and blast damage. So that's a quick look at blast damage. We took a look at the omnidirectional blast versus a directional blast. We talked about blast intensity and how that intensity goes down from starting from A or whatever the initial rating is listed on the weapon, down a step for each concentric ring of hexes around the point of explosion, right? And we also took a look at some ways you can try to save yourself or protect yourself from the damage by either reducing the damage with armor or cover, or attempting to reduce the blast intensity itself by either going prone, or if you really think you need to, jumping on top of the explosive to save your buddies. And the next thing we're going to take a look at is sort of creating your own explosives. Okay, next we're going to look at 8-Fingered Bob's Guide to Improved Explosives. So you can either find a nice case of grenades out there, but what if you need to make your own homemade explosive? Well, what are you going to need? So for a basic improvised explosive, you're going to need one or more unit of explosives. So that's going to be something like dynamite, plastic, whatever else you can find. You're going to need 1 unit of spare parts. This probably represents, either building like a little containment housing for it, anything else you need to kind of shape the bomb. You're going to take 1 shift of work, and it requires a successful tech roll. If you want to get a little fancier and you want to create an improved explosive with a pressure plate or a tripwire, you're still going to need 1 or more units of explosives, 2 units for general spare parts, right? There's a little more mechanics based in this. You got to build the pressure plate, or you got to have the wires. Everything you're doing to connect this sort of a trap still requires 1 shift of work and 1 successful tech roll. Now, if you want to get fancier than that, you can create an improved explosive that uses an electronic trigger or a timer. And this is basically the same thing, except that you're going to also have to have a unit of electric spare parts, right, or electronic spare parts. This is going to be for either your timer itself. You find like an old egg timer or something like that, or if you're using an electric trigger, you're going to need like little radio parts or something like that so it can receive the signal. Okay, so we're going to take a look and see how much material it requires to make an explosive of different blast ratings. So for plastic explosives and dynamite, it requires 1/4 encumbrance of explosive material to create a blast D rated sort of explosive device. Quadrupling that, or for every 1 full encumbrance, it increases the blast radius up a rating all the way up to blast rating of A. When we look at what kind of materials we need to create truly improvised explosive devices from improvised explosive material, that cost goes up. So for improvised explosives, it requires a full encumbrance of material to create a blast D rating explosive device. And again, you have to quadruple that. So for every 4 encumbrance of material, you can increase that blast rating up all the way to A, which is much less efficient than creating it with already standardized types of explosives. So you can also add additional things to your improved explosives. One is to add shrapnel. So this is going to increase its blast rating by 1 step. It does require you to expend an additional general spare part, and you take a penalty of -1 on your tech roll. If you want to create an improvised shape charge, this will increase direct damage by 1. It will assign the crit rating of 1 for the immediate target of the explosion. Armor rating is reduced to 0, so no extra benefit from having armor. It requires an additional general spare part, and imparts a -2 on your tech roll. You can see an example from the equipment list from the book. It shows an improvised grenade. What I'm not sure is how it got a damage 2, because most of our blast weapons don't have an actual direct damage. So I wasn't quite sure how they got from, if you were creating this from scratch, how did it go? It increases the damage by 1, but I'm not sure how they came around to that total. So this has just been a really quick look at 8-Fingered Bob's Guide to Improved Explosives. I'm sure your players will come up with all kinds of really interesting, complicated ways to blow things up in your game, but these are the very basics. So the final thing we're going to look at is other kinds of explosives, and we're just going to talk about white phosphorus. There's probably all different kinds of other explosives that are covered in the book. Things like chemical, nerve agent, stuff like that. We're not going to talk about that in this particular tutorial, but we wanted to bring up white phosphorus because it actually did come up toward the end of our actual play story. Everything is, it's always cloudy in Khalees when one of the antagonists threw a Willie Pete grenade at the group as they were driving Humvee. So we just kind of wanted to go over this because there's some very different rules with the fight with white phosphorus that make it very different than your standard blast weapon. So first, if we take a look there on the right, we can see the white phosphorus card from the player's guide. And we see that there's no damage, no crit listed. And under blast, it has a rating of C, but it also says fire. So let's take a look. The good news is no direct damage, no critical threshold, or is there one? So this might actually be a little misleading because of the fire damage. So the bad news is when you get hit with one of these, you're going to be on fire if it succeeds in the blast roll. Armor is not going to help you. And because white phosphorus burns really, really hot, you are a -2 to your mobility roll to put it out. So fire. We're not really covering a lot of the other environmental hazards that can kill you in Twilight 2000 in this particular tutorial, but we're going to look at fire really quickly because it's particularly nasty. So when you're damaged by fire, so in this case, a white phosphorus grenade, you're basically on fire and you take damage based on the rolls from the intensity of the blast. Actually, it's not really the intensity of the blast, it's the intensity of the fire. So it's very similar though. So because the intensity of the fire is C, it is going to be a D8 and a D8 each round that you're on fire to see whether you're damaged either by 1 point or 2, right? So this is pretty nasty. Here's the really bad thing. So you can try to roll on the ground, put yourself out, have someone dunk you with some water or throw a blanket on you. But if you fail to put the fire out, so again, let me take it back. If you do succeed and you roll 2 failures on a round, the fire goes out on you and you're no longer on fire. However, if you stay on fire, fire increases in intensity. So a fire that starts out of intensity C, if it's not put out in the first round, is going to become intensity B. And then if that fails, intensity A, as you begin to go from, I got some fire on my arm, to I got some fire on my jacket, to now you are running around on fire. So fire is a really, really, really dangerous thing. And because the -2 on mobility to put it out is imparted to you from the white phosphorus, chances are you're going to have some serious damage from this. So we just want to cover this because I don't think we really covered it correctly in our show. And so kind of going back, we wanted to take a look and say, okay, well, how did this white phosphorus, how should have this have worked, right? So in this particular case, when we were looking at folks riding around in a Humvee, you don't roll a regular to hit location like you would for someone took a shot at the Humvee. So in our particular game, we did, and we rolled that it was the passenger that was injured, and so only one person had to make a roll about catching on fire. When in reality, all of the occupants, so the driver, the passenger, and probably also unfortunately the dog in the back seat, would have had to roll or had this fire C class, damage rolled against them, and to see if they're all on fire. What I don't know is I didn't see a rule for a vehicle catching fire, right? So I don't know whether you'd have to roll separately for the vehicle itself to see whether it starts burning, or some of the interior, which is made of, it's not made of metal, they give cloth seats and stuff, or whether that's just too detailed to get involved. I'll leave that up to your GM to decide. So, all right, that's the last thing we wanted to look at was the white phosphorus grenade and how dangerous fire is, amongst other things in Twilight 2000. Okay, that wraps up this episode of Playing With Myself, looking at explosions. I hope that by us covering some of the very basics of blast damage, blast ratings, different kinds of scenarios and ways that you can protect yourself from blast damage is helpful to you and your players, or if you're planning a game, and then how to incorporate these into your scenarios. So until next time, be safe, be kind to each other, and play games.